Everyone, I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of the medical devices rules, and I'm going to cover the following topics. Just what's the background of the legislation, applicability, classification of medical devices, a few important concepts, government authorities that are involved in their role, registration requirement for medical devices, licenses that are involved, labeling requirements, some exemptions, some foreign investments, M&A and PE consideration, and some practical issues. So let's get started. Quickly, industry statistics. It is one of the very rapidly growing industries. It's a $11 billion industry today and expected to be $50 billion by 2025. 70-80% of the requirement is still met by import. It's one of the top 20 market by size in the world and fourth largest in India, in Asia, and about 65% of the manufacturers are domestic players, and MNCs also have established their local presence in India. So what is the background? The background is that there was no specific legislation for medical devices prior to 2017. Medical devices very limited of and a few of them were treated as drugs and were regulated. Accordingly, most as they were not regulated, there were issues around quality, safety, and pricing. Finally, in 2017, these regulations were brought into place, and the intent was that these rules would come into effect by 1st January 2018. However, the definition provided was very narrow, and it still did not cover all the medical devices, as not very few were notified. In 11th February 2020 last year, they came up with this new definition, which is a very wide and catch-all definition, and this notification became effective on 1st April. It's important to look at the definition. It's important to note that the definition has been notified under the definition of drugs, and therefore these medical devices would also be treated as drugs, but governed under the medical devices rules, to the extent the medical devices rules specifically provide for such regulations. Now, what is the definition? The definition is very wide, as you will see. It includes all instruments, apparatus, appliance, implant, material, whether software, accessory, or whether used for humans or animals, and whether it's used for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of any disease or disorder, or any injury or disability, any investigation, replacement, supporting or sustaining life, disinfection of medical devices, and control of conception. So as you will see, it pretty much covers anything and everything under the sun that has something to do with with your health, and therefore everything can be covered under medical devices. For example, a weighing scale or a TheraBand or a wheelchair, or a software in your mobile, everything can be argued to be a medical device. However, once you go into the rules, as you will see, there are two main types. They have classified devices into two main types. One is a medical device, and the other is an in vitro diagnostic medical device. So these are the two broad categories, as you will understand from the rules, and these two further categories are further classified into different classes, which is class A to D, A being the lowest and D being the highest risk. The parameters for classification is also provided in the schedule of the rules, and the CLA, which is the Central Licensing Authority, is authorized to classify such devices and publish it in the website. The first such list was published on 1st November 2017. However, very few devices were notified, about 351 medical devices and 247 in vitro medical devices, diagnostic medical devices. On 3rd September 2020, last year, a few months back, about a draft list was brought out by the regulator. About 1886 devices were clubbed into 24 categories and identified, and they were all kept for public stakeholder comments, and that list has yet not been finalized. So therefore, if today the position is that very few devices have been given clarity on whether they are medical device or not, and under what class do they fall. What are the important concepts? These concepts become important to understand what is applicable to a business and not. So what's an invasive device? As the name suggests, it penetrates into the body. An investigational medical device or a new vitro diagnostic medical device, as you will see on the slide, 2.2 and 3, are those devices which are the subject matter of investigation. Custom made medical device is something that is specifically prepared based on registered medical practitioners prescription. Loan license is something similar to drugs, where manufacturing is done in the existing manufacturing premises. Medical device grouping is again so devices which are having same or similar intended uses, and there is a commonality of technology allowing them to be classified in a group, not reflecting specific characteristics. Intended use is something where the use of the medical device as is approved by the authorities and is contained in the instructions for use or promotional material. Academic clinical study is again a study of or it's not for sort of commercial purposes, but it is more from academic purposes, and it's on a medical device for which has been approved, or it's new for a new intended use, or a new material of construction, new improved use, or it's used on a new population. Clinical evidence is again data collected from the studies, which is your clinical investigation and clinical performance evaluation. Clinical investigation is used in the context of medical devices, and clinical performance evaluation is used in the connection of in vitro diagnostic medical devices. Conformity assessment is again examination of the evidence that has been generated through this process, and it is to determine the safety and efficacy and performance of the devices. Predicate device is something that is used for the first time. It's like a new drug, as if you compare it with drugs. It's a new medical device. It's been used for the first time, or if it has already been approved, then it is going to be used for the for a new intended use, or if it's in different material of construction, or a design, or a different design. Notified body is again a private body which has been authorized under the rules to perform certain functions which are outsourced to it by the regulator, such as audit and inspection of sites. Some of the existing notified bodies have been provided in the slide. Authorized agent is any person in India who is authorized to import and compliances for the manufacturer, foreign manufacturer in India. What are the government bodies? There is CDSCO, the state licensing authorities, national accreditation body, notified body, medical device testing officer or medical officer, which is the inspector. So CLA is of course the highest body, and it takes care of the highest risk devices, which is class C and class D. Import of all devices, clinical investigation or clinical performance related approvals all have to be taken care of and been approved by the CLA, and of course the coordination function of the state licensing authorities. The state licensing authority is in charge of manufacturing licenses for class A and B, and for all wholesale retail supply chain related licenses. A national accreditation body is in charge of notified bodies, and they give accreditation to the notified bodies. Notified bodies, as I just said, is a private body which performs functions which is outsourced to it. And medical officer or the medical inspector, these are inspectors who are in charge of inspecting the sites within the designated area, and they need to confirm compliance, take sample of devices, and where there is a contravention suspected, they initiate prosecution, and perform such kind of functions. There is a sixth government body, which is the central laboratories as well. That's sort of not put on the slide right now. So next slide is again important. Last year, the medical devices rules were amended on 11th February, and new rules, the new registration requirement, a new chapter was introduced, wherein it was required that all medical devices, and mind you, this is medical devices for as defined as on 11th February itself, with the other amendment which I spoke about, and the new definition, the wide definition which came in. So 11th February new chapter also provided that all medical devices need to be registered, except of course those which are exempted in 8th schedule, or those which are already been governed and regulated. Those were not required to be registered separately. This requirement came in on 1st April. All manufacturers or importers are required to do this registration. Registration is online, and importantly, the ISO 13485 compliance certificate is required for registration by the manufacturers and importers, and without that registration may not be possible. And registration number, once it is registered, is generated, and that registration number needs to be mentioned on your label. And this becomes important, especially if you're dealing with any authorities, they may insist to see this registration number. What the timeline is, for the first 18 months from 1st April 2020, the registration is voluntary. After after the 18 months, the registration becomes mandatory. Now, what are the exemptions? Now, once you register, and if you're a class A or B, then you get an exemption from the applicability of the rules, medical devices rules, for 30 months, which is up to 11th August 2022. And if you're a class C or D device, then you get a exemption from the applicability of the rules for a period of 42 months from the date of the notification or the amendment, which is 11th August 2023. If you do not register, then no exemption is available. So, it's important that businesses note this and initiate registration process of their devices. Now, what are the licenses required? I will not take too much time into this, but go through very quickly. So, there is manufacturing license. Again, manufacturing license, as I said, A and B goes to the state licensing authorities. A being the lowest risk, it's easiest to get. Audit and inspection of the site happens after the license. Class B manufacturing license again is pretty quick. Audit needs to be done within 90 days of application, and board is required to give a report within 30 days of the completion of the audit, and license needs to be granted within 20 days. Class C and D are again more risky, so it goes to the central licensing authority. There is a higher scrutiny and inspection is done, and after the report, there is the license can be either granted or rejected, and then in each case there is a process for appeal and if there is a rejection. Now, what are the important conditions that are attached to a manufacturing license, including a loan license, is that most important is change in constitution, and that I will come to later in the slides. It's a defined term, and if there is a change in constitution, then within 45 days it needs to be intimated, the authorities need to be intimated, and within 180 days you need to apply for a fresh license, and the existing license remains valid. Validity of the license, manufacturing license, is perpetual, which is very good, and however you have to still pay fees every 5 years. If there is any minor change to the product, then you need to intimate to the authorities within 30 days, and if there is a major change in the product, then you need to take a prior approval of the government, and that government and regulatory body needs to decide that within 45 days. Apart from that, in terms of important condition, if you see point number 14 on the slide, it talks about closure of manufacturing site for 30 days should be reported to the licensing authority which is concerned, and of course the other provisions on adverse event reporting and recall have been provided. So, all these new provisions become applicable to the medical devices industry as well. Now, if you are dealing with manufacturing of investigational medical device or an in vitro diagnostic medical device, you again need a license. The license is valid for 3-year period. It's only given for very small quantities of investigation of these products, and it is specific to a specified place and site. Import is very similar. Import licenses are very similar to manufacturing license. Interesting thing is that you don't need to get your manufacturing site abroad registered separately. You can apply for a license. Time period provided is 9 months. If the authorities believe that the inspection is to be done, then they will order such inspection. An authorized agent will be required to be appointed in India, who will liaise with the authorities and be responsible for all the compliances. If you want to import the same medical device from another manufacturing site, then same authorized agent needs to be sort of appointed. And similarly, if you want to import additional devices from the same manufacturing facility, then again same authorized agent needs to be appointed. These are the two conditions that are provided. As far as the clinical investigation of these medical devices is concerned for import, if the medical device is to be imported from Australia, Canada, Japan, EU countries or USA, then clinical investigation is not required. Where you are importing from other countries and you are class A or B, then you just have to satisfy the authorities of the safety and performance of the product which you are importing, and once that is satisfied, you can you don't need to do a clinical investigation again in India. But if you are importing from other countries and it's a class C or D device, then you will have to carry out the investigation in India. Conditions I will not go into detail because they are the same as manufacturing, except for the fact that if there is a change in constitution of a foreign manufacturer, that also needs a compliance under the Indian laws. Again, investigational medical device or new in vitro diagnostic medical device, if you are importing, you need a specific license, and those licenses are again, you have to apply, you have to get the licenses specifically for the use, and you can, validity of the license is 3 years, and you can export it if it has not been used and the authorities permit you to export it. Wholesale and retail license continue to be governed by the drugs and cosmetics rules, and if and the existing licenses which are there, they continue to remain valid. Clinical investigation is again specifically provided for medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices, and so for medical devices you need a central licensing authority approval, which is CDSCO approval. Ethics committee needs to be appointed and needs to approve, and that ethics committee is governed by the drugs and cosmetics rules. There's a concept of pilot clinical investigation and pivotal clinical investigation. Pilot is something where it is used first time on humans and very few human subjects, just to get data, and pivotal clinical investigation is a larger number of humans to confirm the data which is generated. Academic concept of academic clinical trial study is also present, and there you don't need any approval from CDSCO to carry out an academic clinical study. You can just go ahead with an ethics committee approval, and of course these studies and data may be waived in certain situations, and if there is a medical device which you are which requires a clinical investigation and it claims substantial equivalence to a predicate device, it should not be marketed unless the CDSCO has approved such a device. Again, clinical investigation the licenses come with certain conditions. These conditions are that the investigation needs to be approved by the ethics committee before the starting investigation. You need to enroll your first participant within a year of approval. You cannot enroll the first participant unless you have registered your clinical trial on the clinical trial registry, and annual status reports need to be filed, adverse events need to be reported, compensation needs to be paid, which are obviously the pretty much the obvious issues in any clinical investigation, clinical trial. And there are new medical devices with no predicate device. If you are importing or manufacturing, it's like a new drug. If you are importing or manufacturing a new drug, then you need a CDSCO approval for import or manufacture. Time period is about 90 days. Clinical data or animal data can be waived in certain situations. What is important is that if clinical results of clinical investigation may not be required if it has already been approved in UK, USA, Australia or Canada. So if you are importing a new medical device or manufacturing a new medical device and that has already been approved in UK, USA, Australia or Canada or Japan, then in that case no clinical investigation is required. However, if the CDSCO is satisfied that the data which is generated of safety and performance and pharmacovigilance of the device, and that there is no evidence that it will act differently on Indian population, and there is an undertaking which is given that they will conduct a post-marketing clinical investigation with the object of safety and performance. In vitro diagnostic medical device with no predicate device is again similar to the medical device, with some common conditions that you need to keep in mind, as you will see on the slide. The first point is, of course, it has to conform with the specification submitted along with the application. Periodic safety update reports need to be filed with the CDSCO for 4 years. For the first 2 years, every 6 months, and for the later 2 years, every year. Update reports need to be filed. The CDSCO needs to be informed of the launch of the medical device, and reports need to be submitted for serious adverse event within 15 days of awareness. Labeling requirements, again detailed labeling requirements are there. Just a couple of points here. One is that there is a new concept of unique identification number after 1st January 2022, which is next year onwards, which will have a device identifier, which is a global trade item number, and a production identifier, which is a serial batch software manufacturing during the manufacturing process which is generated. So these two numbers are required to ensure there is no counterfeiting, and you can trace and identify the original device. Shelf life is another important point which you need to keep in mind, that a maximum shelf life permitted under the rules is 60 months. However, the CDSCO has the authority to extend that if it is satisfied. Again, for importing, if the life of the device is less than 90 days, then minimum 40% life should remain, and if it is more than 90 days, then a minimum of 50% of the life should remain. Okay, what are the exemptions? Exemptions are custom-made devices are exempted from any license requirements for manufacturing and import. Medicated dressings and bandages for first aid. Again, sale license is not required. Medical devices supplied by a doctor to a patient, if specifically prepared for the patient, sale license is not required. If it is supplied by a hospital or a dispensary, maintained or supported by government or local body, then sale license is not required. Mechanical contraceptives, sale license is not required. Small quantities of medical devices donated to charitable hospital for treatment for free of cost, again no import license is required, only NOC is required. And of course 11th February 2020 we discussed for class A and B 30 months exemption, and for class C and D 42 months exemption. So these exemptions are applicable. Okay, let's come to the next important slide, especially from a M&A and private equity perspective. Change in constitution has been defined, which is a great thing. Under the drugs and cosmetics rules, the word change in constitution has been used, but it's not been defined. So here they have defined it, and it's for in the context of a firm, if it's a change from proprietorship firm to a partnership firm or a LLP or vice versa, and in the case of a company, if there's a change, if there's a conversion from a private to a public company, or from a change in the ownership of more than 50% of the shares. So these cases you will constitute non-change in constitution. Interestingly, there is an intimation requirement. In case of import license, if there is any change in the particulars which are provided, such an intimation requirement is not specifically provided for manufacturing licenses. If there is a stoppage, again as I discussed earlier, 30 days or more, then you have to intimate the authorities. And the table on your slide, as you will see, covers the snapshot of the intimation and approval requirements and various situations. Happy to take this through in more detail with you. If you are interested, please do message me for this. Okay, the next slide is again on specifically for foreign investments and mergers, acquisitions and private equity. 100% automatic route is there for medical devices, which is fine. However, there is a slight technical issue that the definition used in the foreign exchange laws and the definition in the medical devices rules are slightly different. May not be very significant, but this should be considered thoroughly before you proceed on a transaction. From a due diligence perspective, what all do you check? You check that the licenses are all available with the target company. Labeling requirements should be checked for each device, whether they are meeting or not. If it's a new medical device or a new in vitro diagnostic medical device, then please check compliances for public for periodic safety update reports and post marketing clinical investigation. Such kind of compliances, adverse events or recalls should be thoroughly checked. Change in constitution, as I discussed in the last slide, if there's been a major change or a minor change through the life of the product, please make sure that you have appropriate licenses or appropriate approvals or intimations in place. Again, DPCO related, so pricing, I will take you through the next slide. So compliance with so what are the practical issues that you come across because of this new medical devices rules? Most important is that earlier so many devices were not regulated, so they had nothing to do in terms of compliance. However, now the whole rules have come in, and huge number of medical devices or devices are now covered as medical devices, and they need to have registration, clinical investigation, licensing, audit, inspection. So this requires additional time, money, manpower. So it's a huge compliance requirement and costs for the companies. The other very important question which keeps coming up is whether, with the company struggling with the new definition on 11th February coming in, whether a particular device is a medical device or not, and there's a huge gray area over there. There's only a few medical devices have been notified, as I've said earlier. So EU companies will have to go to the regulators and assess whether their device is a medical device or not, and then get classification also accordingly. Similarly, registration requirement, again, if you do not know your classification, you do not know whether you're a medical device or not, should you register or not, that's again another gray area which companies will have to grapple with. And whilst 1886 devices have been again come up with a draft or list in September 2020, but that's not yet been final. So that's another call that you'll have to liaise with the authorities to understand where you stand. Again, these, as I said, the medical devices are notified under Drugs and Cosmetics Act and rules. So these are all rules relating to drugs will continue to apply unless you are specifically something is provided under the medical devices rules. So that should be clear. There should be more careful sort of introspection on what rules are applicable to you. There may be some inconsistencies as the drugs laws would be made specifically for drugs and not for all types of medical devices that are being planned to cover here. So there may be inconsistencies and gray areas or difficulties in understanding the relevant requirements. Pricing, again, as I said, the DPCO and NPPA has clarified that pricing regulations apply to medical devices, which means that you may not be able to increase your price, or you may not be able to fix your price more than a particular sort of requirement under the DPCO. For if you're a scheduled drug, or if you're a non-scheduled drug, you will be treated accordingly for medical devices as well. Other laws continue to apply, like legal metrology, packaged commodity rules, which require some labeling requirements such as MRP to be mentioned. These continue to be applied, which means that there will be multiple laws applicable to the same subject matter and multiple regulators, so that can lead to some sort of complications. Advertising related laws also continue to apply to medical devices, as they are also sort of considered as drugs, and there have been some case laws as well in the past where it has been held that certain claims being made by medical devices also would fall under the purview of Drugs and Magic Remedies, Objectionable Advertisements Act, and of course there are other marketing related non-binding voluntary codes which are there, which if a company is a member of the association, they'll be bound by that. Apart from that, the data privacy and consumer protection and competition laws would apply just like any other industry. So these need to be taken care of. So hope you found this presentation useful. Thank you very much.